We're going to talk today about humans, machines, and the dimensions of microwork. I hope some of you had the chance to see Monica Rigatti's talk on Tuesday, where she was talking about the challenges of collecting training data for doing machine learning. And in particular, she spent some time talking about the caveats of using crowdsourcing. If you saw that, that's great. If not, I encourage you to watch the video. This talk, in large part, will be a deep dive into the nuances of how crowdsourcing fits into the work on building data products. So I'm at LinkedIn, and hopefully some of you are familiar with LinkedIn, but the context I want to provide here is that we've worked together on various problems involving either data collection or training or evaluation for LinkedIn's products.
You may be less familiar with Samasource. Samasource was started about 3 years ago, and we're predominantly a microwork company, which means that it's our job to break up tasks that workers can do using a simple internet interface and a computer connection. So we have about 2,000 workers in a closed crowd. They're totally managed and work full-time, but they're in 6 different countries in 16 centers. And what we think sets us apart is not only the fact that we're a nonprofit, but is also that we're very focused on deep industry partnerships to make sure that we're getting to high quality data, so 99.9% plus, which is different than what you'll see from a crowdsourcing platform. So we'll talk a little bit today about how that whole marketplace looks.
So it's interesting, if you look at the history of crowdsourcing a bit, actually the precursor to crowdsourcing is something called human computation. And hopefully some of you are familiar with the work that Luis von Ahn, who's a professor at Carnegie Mellon, did on human computation with efforts like the ESP game or reCAPTCHA. But actually, there's slightly earlier work. In particular, Richard Dawkins, when he wrote The Blind Watchmaker, posited this notion of biomorphs. And what you can see in that little diagram on the right is a kind of human-guided evolution of these shapes done by lines. And he was trying to explain the concept of how biologically like objects could occur if you had a human in the loop who would be guiding the selection process. A little bit of an irony, because you can almost think of this as a kind of intelligent designer, and of course this is Richard Dawkins that we're talking about. But here's kind of the beginning of this notion of human computation. But probably the more current example people think of for human computation is that of the Mechanical Turk. Again, it has its own history. The original Mechanical Turk was an 18th century hoax where the idea was that somebody said, look, we have a mechanical chess player, but actually it was really a small person who was inside, who was playing the game. And Amazon, of course, then took this metaphor to say, could a human be the computer? And this is where you see a lot of the popularization of using human-based computation to do what otherwise would have been thought of as algorithmic work.
So one of the things that's been exciting since the advent of the Turk, as we call it, is that the entire sort of microwork space has exploded. There's something like over 40 crowdsourcing and microwork providers now out there in the world, and they have a range of different models. They range from Samasource, which is a fully managed service, and UTest, which is also a fully managed service. If you ever need software testing, they're great. To the Turk itself, which is an entirely open platform, both for workers and for people who want to work on it, and Crowdflower, which is a layer on top of that. We've seen many companies that are building layers, either technical layers or entire management layers on top of a given workforce. And those workforces can be entirely open, which means that anybody, you, me, literally anybody can get on them and do work for a few pennies a task, or they're entirely closed, which means that they're sort of more of a cultivated crowd. This has huge implications in what sorts of quality, how you manage to that quality, how you structure work to get quality out of a given crowd. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in depth as we go through an example of the work that we've done together.
And, it's important to realize here, we're talking about crowdsourcing in the context of big data. I was actually intrigued. I saw some tweets over the past couple of days which expressed surprise that people who worked in big data would be interested in crowdsourcing. But I think I don't know if some of you remember, I want to say it was a couple of years ago, there was an article that showed where Peter Norvig from Google talked about the fact that Google used human raters for its relevance judgments. And I actually count myself, I hadn't yet worked at Google, as surprised as why not just use click data? But if you think about it, you'll see that there are all those sorts of presentation bias and other issues, which in fact Monica talked about in some detail on Tuesday, mean that you do need human judgments even when you have huge amounts of data coming in to solve certain problems. Now, I want to talk about the 3 areas where crowdsourcing fits. And I use the word crowdsourcing, but I think the term microwork, which I believe is one that Samasource coined, is actually a more appropriate way of thinking about it. Small tasks that can be distributed to large numbers of people help data scientists. The first is data collection. Data collection is actually the most basic task. In fact, it historically would have been done by people, say, writing on paper. But it's not human judgment. This is simply, there's data out there, and every person is a sensor, as the armed forces might say. We can actually use people to collect information. That's straightforward enough. I think the more interesting cases for us are when we actually are using human judgments for training data. I don't know if you can see the diagram on the right. It's actually interesting that some people who look at it, particularly if they're European, might recognize that these are heights. So this is training data for the term where you see tuples, where you have people's heights, their genders, the heights of their parents, and what countries they're from. And with this, you could imagine that you would then build, say, some kind of regression to compute the expected height of a person based on that information. But clearly, in this case, the data is objective and would be as training data. In other cases, you would actually have a subjective component that you would use. The third piece where human judgments can come into play is evaluation. So in the example here, this is one where it's a bit clearer that you would need humans to be involved. It's one of determining if an answer is relevant for a search query. And it's interesting because we could go into a whole separate talk about whether relevance is something that makes sense to think of objectively or not. But what is clear is that if you're going to be trying to judge the quality of an algorithm as relevant to human users, it's not a bad idea to have humans as your evaluators.
So can I ask a quick question? Has anyone here ever used any type of Microwork platform, be it Turk or Crowdflower or even Samasource? Wow, it's like almost half. That's impressive. Okay, so one of the things that's really exciting for me is this is a schematic of Samasource's proprietary technology, the Sama Hub. And this is our work distribution platform. Now, every crowdsourcer, microwork provider, whether they're a managed service or an open platform, has some sort of proprietary technology. And they invest huge amounts in developing this. And one of the things that is so fascinating as a vendor is watching how many companies actually are building their own, which I highly recommend against. One of the things that is really powerful here is that the way that each platform is tailored really drives off of who is working on that platform. So at Samasource, we focus a lot on how you structure a worker development lifecycle. All of our workers are very well known. They've all been recruited in person. They are organized into pods who get all sorts of in-person training. And so our system is not, although it accommodates things like multiple key entry and gold, and it does it very well, we focus a lot more on human review, and our workflows are tailored to make sure that we get one correct answer each time. Whereas in open platforms, you run into this challenge where you're dealing with many, many hundreds or tens of thousands of workers that you have to automate all of the QA for, and those systems are designed for that. Now, it is sort of an irrelevant issue when you're doing a pilot data or you're doing sort of an initial sample of training data. If you need to scale a process, making sure that those workflows hit efficiency is hugely important. And so my interest here is in making sure that you get really, really strong understandings about how the interaction between that technology that your provider is offering and their workforce is going to play out on a quality-based, task-by-task level. One of the things that is really interesting for us is watching the way we design workflows and watching the way users who are predominantly new internet users are interacting and generating quality. We spend almost all of our time as a provider replicating what in some of our clients are actually internal functions, defining those tasks and defining projects in ways that they're very, very actionable by workers on the ground. And we'll talk a little bit about that a little bit more in detail. But what it means is that you want to quickly move from this idea of we're trying to solve build a training set or collect all this data or evaluate a certain output to how does that need to be set up on a given system in order to hit quality. And I'll give you some tips at the end of this, but the correlation between what you're trying to accomplish and the system it runs on are actually very important and widely diverse throughout the Microwork sort of ecosystem. That one's me too. So this, to talk about is specific examples, this is a project we actually ran for LinkedIn last summer for someone in Daniel's group. And what we were tasked with is a data collection project, although we've done many projects for LinkedIn. And this was specifically focused on collecting and standardizing information across thousands of universities worldwide, literally everywhere from Thailand to Azerbaijan. And the thing that was fascinating here was, how do you take what could be a huge amorphous problem, literally, I think we collected over 27 fields for each university. Now, that's a lot of pieces of information to collect and make sure you have right. How do you do that in a scaled and efficient way? I think we delivered it in about 5 weeks and did it with each worker doing one judgment. And we'll talk a little bit about how we did some of the task design so you can think about potholes that you might want to avoid later.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that is really interesting, and I want to point out that we put data collection as what seemed like the easier of the tasks, because as you can imagine, with data like this, that in many cases you don't know what data is even available, even though it seems like a straightforward enough objective task. It's actually quite a challenge to get that right, and Claire will talk about some of the considerations that came up there. But what I want to now dive into are, what are the dimensions of Microwork? Well, that is to say, what are the different things you have to think about in terms of making decisions in how to architect a crowdsourcing solution for your problem? So the first is that objective problems are a lot easier to solve than subjective problems. So if you look on the left, we have this problem of determining if two people are the same. Now, not everybody will agree on the answer. Some of you will be right, and some of you will be wrong. There is a correct answer. And in a situation like this, for example, it makes sense to say, well, perhaps what I want to do is use a collection of independent judgments, because, after all, there's only one answer, and take the most common one. Or, if I trust someone, maybe one judgment's enough. And I don't really care whose it is. What's interesting is that because there's a right answer, the only thing we're really concerned with is accuracy. On the other hand, if we look at the hot or not site on the right, this is the version for monkeys and apes. For other primates in the audience, sorry if this is less appealing. But I will posit that how hot this monkey is a subjective task. I picked this one after looking at 20 myself. And there, accuracy is not necessarily the right way to think about the problem. I mean, after all, you really do want a notion of what is, for example, the distribution in subjective impressions that people have. And you want sincerity on the part of your human judges. But it doesn't make sense to say we're going to find the aesthetic expert on monkeys and have that person do all of our judgments. In fact, you could imagine that if you had some people and they were collaborating or pressuring one another to make choices, you wouldn't get the same value as if you actually did this and leveraged the subjectivity. So another way of thinking about this is to ask, do you want independence? So independent judgments, especially for those of us who like to reason quantitatively, seem extraordinarily valuable. And after all, you can do statistical reasoning with independent judgments. If you assume, for example, that the workers that you have, let's say that their error rate is p, and they get it right 1 minus p. Well, then you can start reasoning over a collection of judgments, what it means to say taking the top 3 out of 5 or top 5 out of 7, determine your acceptable error rates, and frankly, it ends up being really nice from a statistical perspective if you in fact can assume that those judgments are independent, and obviously error rates vary per worker. But you lose a lot. And in particular, what you lose is that if you're concerned, particularly if you're trying to get objective information about just getting the right answer, it might be nice for workers to be able to help each other out. And by definition, if you want independent judgments, you can't allow that. Also, if you actually are insistent on independent judgments and getting more of them to improve your accuracy, then the bottleneck for the accuracy of your system is liquidity. It's the number of workers who are available. And by the way, as you start requiring more workers, and let's face it, in some systems, perhaps the workers know that agreement with each other is going to be used to determine their accuracy and help them get paid, they're incented to cheat, perhaps to create alter egos that perform identical judgments to them. This is actually a problem even in Luis Bonan's original ESP game, that people would essentially play against themselves in order to agree on their judgments. So there's a real cost if you insist on independence.
So this, when you don't have independence, what you have is typically called collusion. And this may look like collusion, but this is actually one of the centers in Ranchi, India, where we ran the LinkedIn project out of last summer. And what you're looking at is actually not workers collaborating on an independent judgment, but what you're looking at is workers going through training data. And what they do typically, and what we focus on is because we find that most problems actually can be structured in a way that don't require independent decisions or independent inputs, that we find that actually training a group to have some sort of shared understanding of what outcome you want to achieve, whether that monkey is hot or not, may not really work in this context, but is that person the same person, is actually highly trainable. And instead of having to run it through 7 different people, our view is that to get to a majority outcome, our view is that this group of people can run through a set of training tasks together. We can see that they've completed that training because they don't typically do it in a group like this. They'll do it on their own workstations. So we can see that they've completed that training, and then we can see how they perform on that training and then gate them into the project. And what that means is that instead of 7, independent judgments, what you're getting is 1 judgment that is accurate 90% of the time. And that is highly unusual, and it means that we have to be really thoughtful in working with our clients about how do we structure projects that avoid those independent constructions, that really tailor to having a static and stable workforce that is trained into here's what a correct outcome is for this. And typically, in the example that I showed, it had a really short instruction. If you had clicked the show instructions, it would have been, boom, half a page, because we go into really detailed and deep. And what that does is it allows some cohesion around what the objective outcome should be.
The other interesting thing is that you can create a market for lemons if you're not careful. Now, for those of you not familiar with George Akerlof's work on this, first I recommend actually that you read Panos Iperiadis' article on how he believed that, I think specifically Mechanical Turk was creating a market for lemons. And this is on his Behind Enemy Lines, a computer scientist at business school blog, which I highly recommend, not only if you're interested in crowdsourcing, but more generally in the intersection between computer science and economics. But what George Akerlof studied in 1970 was the following problem. He looked at people selling used cars. One of the problems with people selling used cars is that there's an information asymmetry. The person selling the car knows whether it's a lemon or, as I found out, the opposite is a cherry. That is a car that works or a car that you will be lucky if you can, tow it back. But the buyer doesn't know. So because the buyer doesn't know, the buyer has to assume that every car is probably a lemon. There will be no way of knowing. And as a result, the buyer is only willing to pay the price for a lemon. Well, as a result, the sellers are unwilling to sell a cherry, a good car, at the price of a lemon, and therefore, in fact, it's self-fulfilling. All the cars are lemons. And so this is a case of the bad displacing the good. We have lemon laws. The used car market hopefully isn't as bad as it was back in 1970. But this brings us to the current state of microwork. Well, one of the things that happens is that we've talked about the work. We didn't yet talk about how it's paid for, right? Work is paid for. Well, people who are creating the tasks put prices on them. You don't want to pay a lot unless you're going to get good quality work. But if you don't have good signals from workers to determine if their work will be of good quality, you don't want to pay very much for it. You don't pay a lot of money. Quality workers don't want to participate. As a result, you end up, as my friend used to say, they pretend to pay and we pretend to work. Mm-hmm. Now, you could say, well, there are ways around that. You can have quality tests. You can actually allow people to develop reputations. But let's get back to the context for this slide. At what price independence? The whole notion of independent judgments was you could get a lot of them from as many people as possible. The moment you start saying, well, only from people whose judgments are of high quality, only from people who've developed a reputation over time as they've used them, that's starting to sound a lot like they're not so independent anymore. You're restricting your set. You're learning from them. You're systematically skewing the crowd that you have. This could be a good thing. If you, in fact, you simply want a high-quality, accurate answer, that's fine. But then you have to start giving up the notion that you're simply going to be getting a collection of independent judgments and treat them like IID variables that you can combine.
So we focus instead, we believe that on open platforms that, sadly there is no lemon law for micro workers. We try to think of ourselves as the lemon law. Samasource takes a very different approach to this, and I think it's worth thinking about. I sort of delivered it out here so that you can see sort of what some of the internal workings are, because much of what happens when you create something, when you create a project for workers to work on, is either going to happen on your team or on your provider's team. And so knowing how to do that well is helpful in either case. In our system, what we do is first we do really deep task design. So with LinkedIn, we did, I think, about 3 weeks of task design. I think we did 4 separate calls, which are really informational, just getting information out of the client to really understand what their objectives are. And those go from, in general, what are you trying to accomplish with this business, to literally down to, okay, so what currency should we translate all of the ranges for tuition into? Do you want it in American dollars? Do you want it in euros? Do you want it in the native currency? And breaking their business need down into a very, very specific task design. And this goes to style guides. We also do a lot of content generation for product descriptions on e-commerce platforms, or Q&A websites will provide answers. One of the challenges is that the more detailed you can be, the better in this task design project. All of that front-end work, ensuring that you have a really, really clear understanding of what you want your output data to look like. We typically will send that data, a mock-up of that data in a spreadsheet to the client and have them sign off on that. That's how we know we've gotten to the correct task design. And that is the fundamentally most important part. I would say that about 70% of the projects that come into Samasource haven't really gone through a fully fleshed out task design. Occasionally we'll see phenomenally well-developed stuff, but the more you can invest there, the less you'll pay on the back end, and the better you'll be able to manage workers. So then for us, what happens, and you can also do this on Turk, although you'll end up doing it yourself, is that you staff up the project. So what we do is we'll go into our crowd of workers who we've gated in person and done sort of general training with around skills and computer skills, language skills. All of our workers are English fluent, so all of our training happens in English. That's something to particularly look for. It makes training a lot easier if everyone speaks the same language. And we'll staff up the project, which means that we'll gate them either through qualifying tasks, but typically through a combination of tasks and training modules. It's really easy using Jing to build video training. I can do a training module in 5 minutes just by doing a screen share. And that simple walkthrough is hugely, hugely beneficial, and not enough people do it. So we do all of that internally. Our project managers do that. And then the workers will do the work, and then it'll get distributed to a QA. Now, there's a million different ways that you can QA Microwork. You can do multiple key entry, where you send the same task out to 7 or 9 or 5 or however many people. And I'll post some things on my Twitter feed that talk about how you get to that correct level of data in an open platform. But you can also simply just have another person look at it who's a second level worker. We tend to rely on methods like that because they get to higher accuracy at a pretty cheap cost. And then it'll go through some review internally. It's really important in that early stage for this to be a slow process, to make sure you work out the kinks before you put 100,000 tasks on an open platform. We have seen and cleaned up certain disasters. We have also, in our early days, had a few disasters ourselves, but no longer. And then ultimately we deliver. And one of the really, really cool things about the advent of Microwork is that, when crowdsourcing and Odesk and Elance started, it was all flat file transfer. You sent a CSV file over, you sent over whatever the materials were, and now it's all happening through web interfaces and through APIs. We can certainly still do file transfers and do a lot of our communication through Basecamp, and have even done some file transfers through FTP recently for really monster files. But we typically just back end into their system through an API, either a custom one we build from ours, or we will tack into their system. And thinking about the flows of those things, figuring out how do you scale that information throughput if you're going to scale a project, making sure that you're testing for all the things that could drive down a per task cost early, sort of in that design phase, is really beneficial.
So I think really to reinforce Claire's point, a lot of the work I've seen in crowdsourcing relies far too heavily on the back end. It basically in some ways treats the workers almost as adversarial, and in many platforms that can be a problem, particularly if you're potentially thinking, how can I pay them as little as possible? But part of that adversarial dynamic can be that one is that you end up spending more on checking if the work is correct than you actually deliver to the workers. But the other thing is that you neglect some of the most obvious things to do, which are to actually avoid making the task unnecessarily difficult. To reiterate Claire's points, provide clear instructions, be transparent about your goals, give early feedback, because actually, if you have a cooperative relationship with your workers, you might actually get better results. The example that, if I may borrow this one, is that we learned early on when we were working with Samasource on getting some of the EDU information that the numbers weren't coming back in consistent formats. You could imagine in some platform we would have said, we're going to penalize the workers that didn't give us the right form of results. Why not simply as quickly and as early as possible say, hey, we're working together, let's get this out, do that early feedback. That's one of the reasons to do these rapid iterations, but work together. The other thing, though, which is a lot more subtle, it's easy to say make it simple. The problem is that, I think it's Einstein who said that you want to make it as simple as possible, but no simpler than that. And there's a trade-off between task value and difficulty. Look, it's a lot easier to select one of these choices than have an essay question, an open-ended answer. It's even easier to just say, is this right or wrong? Is this hot or not? The typical binary classification tasks. But we're talking about using human workers, and we actually have brains that are extraordinarily powerful. And a lot of the reason for using crowdsourcing is to actually leverage the power of that human intelligence. So, an example from my past life actually was trying to help establish what the official home pages were for local businesses. Now, we could ask, is this the home page? But what we really wanted to do sometimes was say, can you find the home page? Well, that's an open-ended problem, and the answer may be, no, I can't. But human beings can pick up the phone, can call their friends, can look at all sorts of sites online. Why not take advantage of that rather than treating a human being as a simple API that looks at a page and says yes or no? But the moment that you make that task more difficult and open-ended, it's going to be a lot harder. You can't place the same kind of assumptions about how well your workers will do it. So you have to evaluate that trade-off very carefully.
Yeah. So an easy task actually looks like a data mining project, a data collection project. So finding 2 or 10 or 20,000 foreign universities in Azerbaijani and Thai and whatever language, pretty easy task, even if it has 27 fields, because all of the outcomes are fairly objective. We did another project for a research team that was on interpreting press releases and understanding what was going on in those press releases and categorizing business events. Now, the challenge there is that your categories have to be perfectly NICE, and they have to be really understandable. And so the subjectivity, the structure can actually create that difficulty. We also do a lot of content generation, which I mentioned, which is totally subjective. However, if you've got a 17-page style guide, it becomes pretty unsubjective pretty quickly. Even giving people a lot of room over the content, how that content comes out is fairly described. So I think that really driving complexity and difficulty out of this comes down to saying, what is the fastest way to make this decision as unambiguous as possible? Can I answer yes or no about whether or not this is good or not, even if it's not perfectly objective?
Yeah, and this is really tricky because obviously, if you really could clearly say what you wanted, you would have an algorithm for it, and you wouldn't use people for it. So I don't know if some of you saw Sam Shah's talk, but looking at things like, for example, if two people are similar, well, that is not entirely subjective, but there's clearly a subjective component. If we had a characterization that were algorithmic, we would just use it. The whole point of using human judgments is to cause us that tension in our heads as we try to figure that out, but nonetheless exploit it. So I think, again, as Claire said, you try to make it as unambiguous as possible, but clearly, if you could make it completely unambiguous, you probably wouldn't need people to do it. Mm-hmm. Now, the third thing I'd say to watch out for here is systematic bias, and this can be insidious. Mm-hmm. For example, when we're using people to solve problems, one of the sources of bias is that we're actually using everyone of the same species. No aliens. Well, as far as I know, they're among us. But what I mean by that is that people actually are likely to solve problems in similar ways. And actually, if you ask certain kinds of problems, they may not just think in similar ways, they may use a set of available tools in similar ways. For example, if you're asking them to find information, the example I gave earlier about, say, finding the homepage for a business, I'm pretty sure most of you would start by choosing your search engine of choice, and looking up the business on that search engine. And I'm going to assume here that probably 2 or 3 search engines account for most of the folks in this room, 2 more if you want to go over the world. Well, that's nice. That's not really why we brought humans into the equation, to become essentially simulated bots. In fact, not only can this lead to incorrect or not very useful results, it can even be illegal. Because you might imagine that what you're doing now is paying people to effectively scrape some source. So if the concerns about accuracy aren't enough, you should even think about the ethical and legal implications of what workers may be doing that reflects the systematic bias, which, by the way, you may even have pushed them into by the very training that you gave them. So that's something that you really have to watch out for.
And one final point on that, I don't know if anyone saw the recent coverage of Odesk and the content moderation work that they've been doing. They've been providing hundreds of thousands of human judgments for Facebook on content that's been flagged. And when we talk about systematic bias is both very beneficial and very challenging. One of the kinds of systematic bias that we see, and we do very, very little work that works in violence or porn or content moderation of that sort, because we have a worker base who's highly sensitive to it. And so we choose not to do that kind of work because we know our systematic bias both is going to make it really hard to calibrate, and because it's work that our workers don't really want to do. It can also come out, one other interesting thing that it can come out in is that if you're trained in a former British colony, if you're trained how to speak English in that colony, your grammar and your syntax and your usage are both highly accurate and highly formal. So if you're trying to replicate the tone of a hip and modern consumer internet site, that kind of calibration, you need to push all the systematic bias out of that as well, because they will feel like they're using bad English. But that's sort of the final point. I'm sorry we don't have a ton of time for Q&A, but we'll stick around. We would love to hear from all of you.
Yeah, I just want to, sort of to wrap up, since we don't really have a conclusion slide other than that we're taking your questions and we're both hiring, is that when you think about crowdsourcing, it's very easy to think of it in a binary way. It's a way of getting data. Mm-hmm. And what I hope you've gotten out of this talk are some of the nuances that you have to think about, how objective versus subjective your problem is, whether you actually want independent judgments or want the benefits of collaboration for accuracy. And finally, this trade-off between task difficulty and value, where, again, you should really think of a bias as making your task as easy as possible while still getting something. So with that, I'd like to thank you and open for questions. There's a microphone right there if anybody's curious.
Hi. I arrived 5 minutes late, so I'm sorry if you said that in your intro. I'm just curious, did LinkedIn use Samasource for Card Munch?
I can answer that. No. So Card Munch does not use Samasource for there. As you might imagine, one of the interesting things about Card Munch is because of the very high volume and the very low latency requirements. We have gone with another service.
But it is made by humans.
I'm sorry,
though.
is that incorrect on that?
No, we do help with some of their stuff.
Yeah.
We do the gold data for them, and we've actually been talking to Sid about taking over some of the multiple times.
Right.
We do a lot of real-time work.
Cool.
I stand corrected.
So given the increased sort of startup time for doing what kind of at Samasource you define as a good project, what's the minimum kind of rule of thumb for a project that's going to make sense in terms of total duration, total cost, number of workers, that kind of thing?
Sure. I think for us, it's, if it's something that's going to scale like crazy, we're happy to start small. I think, we look at minimums of around a spend of about $5,000 a month right now, just because we invest a boatload on the front end to get workers trained. But typically, we come out highly competitive on a per task price basis, and certainly on a management overhead cost. We haven't done the full ROI on that, but I would venture that given that none of your project management is happening in-house, like literally none of it, and none of your QA is happening in-house, and if anything goes wrong, you can call me.
Well, that was one of my questions on the QA. So for the project you did for LinkedIn, I have to assume there was some post-delivery of the data QA that you were doing, right? Inside LinkedIn.
Yeah, one of the things I want to point out with sort of the cost of a project, there's a startup cost that is inevitable for any time that you're asking somebody else to do a task for you. And one of the things that we think about is, for example, we do, for some of our work, in-house developers will do their own evaluation. You could think, wow, we're having our own engineers and scientists doing tasks we could turk out. But it may be that we only really want to do 50 judgments. We're going to get what we need from that. And actually preparing a task wouldn't make sense if it's out of the blue. So clearly, there's a scale where it's so small that it doesn't make sense for a variety of reasons. That's actually a calculation you have to do on a per-task basis.
Thank you.
Are there kinds of tasks where you talked about the sort of bias, but actually thinking about domain knowledge? So, for example, if you wanted to be extracting brand names out of English text, for example, particularly if it's poorly capitalized, poorly formatted text, that's something that onshore workers often can do sort of fairly naturally just because they are already familiar with the brands. Do you have tasks like that, and how does the cost break down? How do you think about that?
Yeah, you would be wildly surprised at how, all of our workers are people, young professionals in their 20s with like high school and some college education who are all on Facebook. Like they watch American TV. The amount of a cultural leap you have to make is nominal. And so for stuff like that, I'd be like, that's easy.
Okay.
If you want to make it really difficult, make it in Russian. Like that would be hard, but like in English, that's a piece of cake.
I think in the LinkedIn context, where this could come up in a strong way is where you'd like to know, in order to solve the task, you need either the context of highly specific domain knowledge about, say, a professional area,
right.
Or where it gets even next to impossible to use crowdsourcing at all is when the decisions are so personalized. For example, if I want to understand something about whether you would be interested in reading a certain article or in considering a certain job, and my only version of you is, for example, your profile, there's a limit to how far I can go. Presumably, from my ability to empathize with you, would do better than perhaps somebody in a different profession. There is some base you can do, but there's a continuum there of the degree to which context can be transferred and absorbed. So I find that actually is more challenging than culture. I think to Claire's point, the cultural leaps aren't necessarily as huge. The highly sort of specialized professional ones can be. I think we've gone a couple of minutes over, so thank you again. Certainly find me or Claire anytime. We'll be here throughout the day.
Thanks.